Thursday, the 12th of March, 2026, the Paramount Theater, Austin, Texas. A documentary called Capturing at Bigfoot has its world premiere in the documentary spotlight section of the South by Southwest Film Festival. And within hours of the credits rolling, something starts moving through Bigfoot forums, Facebook groups, and podcast feeds that hasn't happened in decades. Panic. Not the fun kind cryptid enthusiasts are used to. The kind that comes with a blurry new trail photo or a fresh set of footprints in the mud. Real panic. The kind that comes from watching the single most famous piece of evidence in the history of your entire belief system get taken apart on screen by the son of the man who filmed it. That evidence is the Patterson-Gimlin Film. 59.5 seconds of shaky 16mm footage shot on the 20th of October 1967 along a tributary of the Klamath River in the Six Rivers National Forest of Northern California, on a stretch of creek so remote that its exact filming location was actually lost for decades, under regrown foliage, only being rediscovered by researchers in 2011. It shows a tall, dark hair-covered figure walking across a sandbar, turning briefly to look back at the camera before disappearing into the treeline. The men who shot it, Roger Patterson and his friend Robert Gimlin, always known simply as Bob, said they'd stumbled across the creature, crouched by the creek, and gave chase on horseback before Patterson grabbed his camera and started filming for close to 60 years. That footage, nicknamed Patty by the community that grew up around it, has functioned as the gold standard of Bigfoot evidence, more analyzed and more argued over than any other piece of cryptozoological material in American history, sometimes compared in sheer scrutiny to the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination. It's been referenced constantly in pop culture, argued over on the Joe Rogan Experience, and analyzed frame by zoologologists, film specialists, special effects artists, and fursuit designers who could never quite reach a consensus. Some saw a man in a costume. Others swore the gait, the muscle movement. The sheer indifference to being filmed proved this was something real. And for decades, in the absence of a recovered suit or credible on-camera confession from either filmmaker, the argument simply never ended, propped up in part by a genuinely puzzling question skeptics have raised for years. If this was a hoax cobbled together in 1967, why has no film crew using period-accurate equipment, the same remote location, and a comparably convincing costume ever managed to recreate something that looks anywhere close to as persuasive, even now with vastly better technology available? It's a fair question, but it cuts both ways just as easily since believers rarely stop to ask why. If a genuine unknown primate really was filmed walking across an American creek bed in broad daylight, nobody has ever managed to capture anything nearly as clear again in the 60 years since. Despite every hiker, camper, and hunter in North America now carrying a high-definition camera in their pocket at all times, capturing Bigfoot, directed by Mark Evans, changes that, not through some flashy new frame analysis or AI enhancement, but through something far more old-fashioned and far harder to dismiss. Family testimony. A decades-old reel of film that had been sitting locked in a safe in a confession that comes from inside the Patterson family itself. The story of how that reel surfaced is almost as strange as the footage on it. In June 2022, an Olympic College film instructor named Teresa Brooks was going through her late father's belongings after his death. Her father, Norm Johnson, had worked in a film lab at Boeing during the exact years the Patterson-Gimlin film was made. And through his brother Dave, he had a direct personal connection to both Patterson and Gimlin. Locked away in Norm Johnson's safe, Brooks found a reel of 16mm film that had apparently sat untouched for decades. She reached out to a filmmaking colleague, Mark Evans, and handed it over. What Evans found on that reel, once he had it properly developed and examined, was 40 seconds of Kodachrome footage that appeared to have been shot in 1966, a full year before the famous encounter at Bluff Creek. It showed a dress rehearsal, a skinnier, less convincing figure in a fursuit, walking through wooded terrain strikingly similar to the site Patterson and Gimlin would use 12 months later. Not a chance encounter with an unknown primate, a practice run. Evans didn't stop at the film canister. He went looking for the people who'd actually lived through 1967. And the person whose account carries the most weight in the entire documentary is Roger Patterson's own son, Clint, now 66 years old and working as a rancher in Montana. Clint's relationship with his father growing up had been, by his own description, something close to hero worship. And yet, in capturing Bigfoot, he's also willing to call his own father a liar on camera. Roger Patterson died of Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1972 when Clint was just 12 years old. To his very last day, by every account from everyone who knew him, Patterson insisted the creature in his film was real. But roughly a decade before the documentary was made, Clint says his mother, Patricia, privately told him the truth, that the whole thing had been staged. He says he seriously considered writing a tell-all book about it. When his mother found out he was thinking about going public, worried about losing the licensing income the film had generated for the family for decades, she disowned her own son over it. He stayed quiet for years after that, carrying the secret until Mark Evans showed him the newly discovered 1966 rehearsal reel and gave him, in his own words, a way to finally tell the truth. Patricia Patterson herself appears on camera in the documentary, too. Her first time ever speaking publicly about any of it, she doesn't offer a tidy, quotable confession. What she does say, describing what the film and the decades of attention around it have done to her family, is that it's been a living hell curse. It's an unusually raw thing for a woman in her position to say about the very footage that funded her family's income for half a century. And it lands with a very different kind of weight than any frame-by-frame analysis of a shaky forest video ever could. Then there's Bob Hiermis, 80-some years old by the time the documentary was filmed, who has been telling anyone willing to listen since 1999 that he was the actual person zipped inside the Bigfoot costume back in 1967. For over 2 decades, Hieronymus was mostly dismissed by true believers, occasionally cited by skeptics, and largely ignored by the mainstream press, in part because his testimony over the years has contained inconsistencies, and in part because no physical suit, no receipt, no photograph of the costume itself has ever surfaced to back up his claim. Capturing Bigfoot doesn't magically produce that missing suit, either. What it does is place Hieronymus' account inside a much larger, much more corroborated picture, interviewing residents of Yakima, Washington, people who actually knew Patterson-Gimlin. And Hieronymus, back in the era the film was made, several of whom back up pieces of his story, describing him as exactly the kind of local tough guy Patterson would have recruited for a physically demanding, secretive job, like walking around a remote creek bed in a homemade animal suit for a few hours. And then there's the scene that even skeptics who followed this story for years describe as genuinely explosive. At a Bigfoot conference in 2024, Clint Patterson and Bob Hieronymus attended together and waited in line to speak with Bob Gimlin. By then in his 90s, and by that point a beloved, almost saintly fixture on the Bigfoot convention circuit, still publicly maintaining, as he had for close to 60 years, that he had no knowledge of any hoax. According to the documentary, the two men told Gimlin they wanted to finally come clean together publicly once and for all. And, according to Evans, who reportedly caught the entire exchange on camera, Gimlin initially agreed. He was willing to go on record and confirm the hoax. Before he could actually say it out loud, his wife intervened and stopped him. Sit with the weight of that scene for a second, because it isn't just dramatic television. It directly contradicts 60 years of public denial from the one man at the center of this story who was never supposed to be in on it. Gimlin has spent decades as the last honest man standing. The one filmmaker who never profited from confessing, never wavered, never gave skeptics anything to point to. And the newly discovered 1966 rehearsal reel doesn't just show some skinny figure in a costume walking through the woods. According to the documentary, it places Gimlin himself at the scene of that rehearsal, which, if accurate, quietly ends his decades-old, long public claim that he had no knowledge whatsoever that anything was staged. It's worth pausing on that costume argument for a moment because it's been one of the longest-running technical debates in the entire saga, and capturing Bigfoot lands right in the middle of it. Skeptics have long pointed out that a convincing ape-like suit was absolutely achievable with 1967 technology, noting that a fairly realistic gorilla costume had already appeared on screen nearly 2 decades earlier in the 1948 film Are You With It? And that Planet of the Apes, with far more elaborate makeup and prosthetic work than anything Patterson could have afforded, hit cinemas the very next year in 1968. The counter-argument from believers has always been that Planet of the Apes required extreme close-ups of actors' faces in sharp focus, something the Patterson-Gimlin footage never attempts since its subject stays at a distance, out of focus, and in constant blurry motion. Exactly the conditions that would make a Crutter homemade costume look far more convincing on grainy 16mm film than it ever could in a brightly lit Hollywood soundstage. Attempts to recreate the film using period-accurate equipment and a comparable costume, including one notable effort for a British television documentary, have consistently failed to produce anything nearly as persuasive as the original, a result Bigfoot believers point to as proof the footage can't be faked, and skeptics point to as proof only that Patterson himself simply got lucky or was better than expected. With a specific combination of blur, distance, and lighting, he captured that October afternoon. And this isn't the only Bigfoot hoax confession in American history to follow a strangely similar pattern either. Decades before capturing Bigfoot, a separate figure named Ray Wallace spent years faking giant footprints around Bluff Creek using carved wooden feet strapped to his boots. Footprints that had actually helped popularize the term Bigfoot itself in the local press back in the 1950s. Wallace never fully admitted his own hoax while he was alive. It was only after he died in 2002 that his own family came forward publicly and confirmed what skeptics had long suspected. A case Bigfoot researcher Lauren Coleman has since argued was wrongly conflated in international media coverage with the entirely separate Patterson-Gimlin footage from 1967. Even though the two hoaxes, if that's what they both turn out to be, are unconnected events involving different men, different methods, and different decades, none of this happened in isolation from the wider, stranger backstory of who Roger Patterson actually was and what he was originally trying to build. In the months before the famous encounter in May and June of 1967, Patterson had already been filming an entirely different project, a docudrama about cowboys hunting Bigfoot led by an old miner and an Indian tracker with a storyline built around flashbacks to earlier reported sightings. He used at least 9 volunteer acquaintances as actors and crew over 3 days of shooting, including both Gimlin and Hieronymus. Patterson and Gimlin were both former rodeo riders and amateur boxers, local champions in their weight classes, the kind of men entirely comfortable in front of a camera and entirely comfortable improvising. Patterson had made trips to Hollywood in the years before, meeting contacts in the film industry. And at one point, he and his associates copyrighted the term Bigfoot itself, hoping to cash in on a planned feature film that never fully came together for lack of investors. By the time Patterson and Gimlin loaded 3 horses sideways into Gimlin's truck and drove out to the Six Rivers National Forest that October, Patterson had already spent months trying and largely failing to build a commercial Bigfoot project. The footage that would go on to define his entire legacy was shot in the middle of that broader, already money-motivated hustle, not as some spontaneous, unplanned brush with the unknown. The reaction from the existing Bigfoot research establishment was fast, and in some corners, furious. Matt Moneymaker from the EE long-running Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization dismissed the entire premise almost immediately, asking pointedly how anyone could believe a supposedly newly discovered reel of film in the age of artificial intelligence, arguing that even if a real physical reel had genuinely been found, there was no way to verify that what audiences were actually shown in the documentary was really what was on it. He went further, describing this kind of debunking attempt as chicanery that had been going on since at least the 1990s, and insisting flatly that the original film itself debunks any attempt to debunk it. Mark Evans has pushed back directly against the AI accusation, stating plainly that the documentary contains no AI-generated material whatsoever, that he and his team are, in his words, 100% confident in what they have. Capturing Bigfoot's producers also paid a $30,000 licensing fee just to legally use clips of the original 1967 footage inside the documentary itself, a detail that undercuts at least somewhat the idea that this was some cheap, unlicensed hit job thrown together to generate outrage clicks. To its credit, the documentary doesn't try to pretend the debate around Bigfoot itself is settled. It goes out of its way to include voices on the other side of the argument, too. Interviewing anthropologist Jeffrey Meldrum, who has spent years arguing that the figure in the original footage displays what he describes as real mammalian musculature, the kind of anatomical detail he believes would have been essentially impossible to fake convincingly with 1960s costume technology, and who has written extensively elsewhere about the Wallace footprint hoax and the serious problems with treating it as somehow discrediting every other piece of Bigfoot evidence by association. It also brings in Bill Munns, a genuine Hollywood makeup and visual effects specialist, to weigh in from the perspective of someone who has actually built movie monsters for a living, offering a rare case where an actual industry professional, rather than an armchair enthusiast on either side, gets to assess just how difficult replicating this specific footage really would have been with the tools and budget Patterson actually had access to in 1967. Evans and his co-writer Michelle Whitten have been explicit that the documentary was never really designed to answer the underlying question of whether Bigfoot itself is real. Their stated goal was simply to tell this one specific human story about one family, one confession, and one reel of film as honestly as they could. And by most early reviews out of Austin, that's exactly the film they made, running an hour and 43 minutes and building its case methodically around 3 central pillars: Clint Patterson's testimony, Patricia Patterson's first ever on-camera appearance, and the newly discovered 16mm reel itself. It's worth being honest about the limits of what's actually been proven here too, because the strongest version of this story deserves the same scrutiny its skeptics apply to the original film. Critics who've looked closely at the pattern running through this entire saga point out something genuinely uncomfortable. Confessions in the Patterson-Gimlin story have a habit of arriving late, sometimes decades late, and almost always once the person the confession is actually about is already dead or otherwise unable to respond. Hieronymus came forward with his claim 32 years after the fact, in 1999. A separate, entirely different Bigfoot hoax confession involving a man named Ray Wallace and his decades of faked footprints only became public after Wallace himself died in 2002, when his own family finally went on record. Clint Patterson says he learned the truth from his mother roughly a decade before capturing Bigfoot was made and sat on it that entire time. And Gimlin's own near confession, arguably the most dramatic single piece of evidence in the whole film, was interrupted before he ever actually said the words out loud. meaning even that moment is technically an implication rather than a direct completed admission. None of that necessarily means any of it is false. Families do sit on painful secrets for years. Elderly men do get talked out of confessions by protective spouses in front of a camera. But it's worth naming clearly that Clint Patterson's account of what his mother told him privately is in the strictest sense hearsay about a private conversation. And that Patricia Patterson's own on-camera line about a living hell curse, while emotionally devastating, is in itself a direct explicit admission that the footage was staged. The documentary's case is genuinely powerful. It is not, strictly speaking, a signed confession backed by physical evidence. The actual suit, the one single object that would end the argument completely on its own, has still never been recovered. And nobody in the film claims to know where it ended up. And yet, for all that reasonable caution, something has clearly shifted since that Thursday night premiere in Austin. Reviewers who walked in expecting a standard, affectionate cryptid documentary have described being genuinely caught off guard by how far Evans was willing to push the material and by how much of the film's real power comes not from any single smoking gun clip, but from watching Clint Patterson, now in his 60s, finally say out, Lou, what he says he's been carrying quietly for a decade. Large parts of the online Bigfoot community, according to reporting since the premiere, have reluctantly come around to accepting that the specific footage they'd spent decades defending really was staged. That doesn't mean the broader phenomenon collapses along with it. Bigfoot is a cultural icon, a folklore figure woven through American identity for generations. It was never actually built on this one reel of film alone, whatever its outsized symbolic importance. Sightings, tracks, and strange sounds in the deep woods will keep being reported long after this particular argument is settled. Because belief in Bigfoot was never really contingent on any single piece of evidence surviving forensic scrutiny in the first place. Bigfoot conventions will still sell out. Trail camera footage will still circulate every autumn. Podcasts will still debate blurry photographs from national parks. The Patterson-Gimlin film mattered because it was for decades the best evidence anyone had, not because it was the only reason anyone believed. And those are two very different things collapsing at very different speeds. What makes this story genuinely stick, though, isn't really the forensic detail of a rehearsal reel or a licensing fee or even Gimlin's interrupted confession. It's the peculiar, uncomfortable paradox sitting right at the center of Roger Patterson himself, the one person who can no longer speak for himself at all. By every account from the people who actually knew him, Patterson wasn't a cynical con man laughing all the way to the bank. While privately certain Bigfoot was nonsense, he seems to have genuinely believed right up until the day he died of cancer in 1972 that the creature he'd spent years chasing was real out there somewhere in those forests, waiting to eventually be found and to vindicate everything he'd built his life around. And at the exact same time, according to his own son, his own wife, and the reel of film that sat locked in a stranger's safe for decades, he apparently also staged the single most famous piece of evidence for that belief with his own hands, using a costume, a volunteer writer, and a rehearsal shot a full year in advance. Whether a person can genuinely believe in something and knowingly fake the proof of it at the same time isn't really a question. A documentary or a stabilized frame or a family's decades-old secret can never fully answer. It's simply the strange human contradiction. Capturing Bigfoot leaves sitting in the room once the credits finally roll. The reaction from believers themselves once the shock started to settle has been messier and more emotional than any of the technical arguments about frame rates or costume scenes. Some members of the community, who had spent years admiring Patricia Patterson as a loyal widow defending her late husband's legacy, turned on her sharply once her comments started circulating, accusing her of lying for money without offering any actual evidence to back that accusation up, questioning her mental fitness with nothing to support it, and speculating that she'd somehow been manipulated by the filmmakers into saying things she didn't mean. It's the same defensive, sometimes ugly reflex that showed up around the Wallace footprint confession back in 2002. And it points to something bigger than any single piece of footage. For a lot of people who built genuine, sincere belief systems around Patty over 5 decades, this documentary isn't just correcting the historical record. It's asking them to grieve something they thought was permanent. That contradiction is exactly what makes the film's final image, in a sense, more haunting than any grainy 60-year-old creek bed footage ever managed to be. Patterson spent the final years of his life dying of a disease that gave him plenty of time to know the end was coming, leaving behind a wife and 3 young children with almost nothing except a reel of film he'd staged, a copyright on a made-up word, and an unshakable, apparently sincere belief that somewhere out past the treine, the real thing was still waiting to be found. He never got to see whether he was right. Bob Gimlin, still alive at 94, has spent nearly 60 years since then, either protecting that same secret or, if the documentary's most explosive scene is to be believed, coming within a single interrupted sentence of finally letting it go. And the suit itself, the one object that could end this argument permanently in either direction, has never been found, never been photographed, never turned up in an attic or barn or an estate sale anywhere in America. It is entirely possible that it simply no longer exists at all. Burned, buried, or quietly thrown away decades ago by people who never imagined anyone would still be asking about it 60 years later. For now, the argument over Patty finally has an ending. Even if the mystery Roger Patterson spent his whole life chasing never actually did, and even if the community that grew up around his footage is left once again exactly where it has always stood, convinced on faith rather than proof that the truth is still out there somewhere, just past where the cameras happen to stop rolling.